Hope you all are enjoying the conference. I found this to be an inspiring week and have enjoyed and learned a lot from the talks that we've had this week. And I wanted to start by talking about one of the major takeaways I've had from my experience at OCON so far this week. This came across especially in Yaron Brook's talk on the first day of the conference about American politics. And what really came across to me, is something I knew, but it was emphasized so strongly that we're entering a time that is going to be pivotal in terms of the future of the culture. We need change. There are many big and serious problems. And we know how to solve them. We know what the solution is. We know that what is necessary is a change in the philosophical ideas of our culture. We know that we need to spread a rational philosophy. But how do we do that? What is required for that to take place? The most powerful tool that we have in spreading objectivism is undoubtedly Atlas Shrugged, right? That's a book that was life-changing for many of us, maybe all of us in this room. It changed our minds, it inspired us, it, in many cases, sent us on a different course in life and convinced us to change how we think about politics, culture, all sorts of really important issues. But what's required for us to be able to actually get that value from Atlas Shrugged? It's a 1,000-page novel that deals with a lot of abstract philosophical questions. The way that it actually, the experience of actually reading it looks something like the first slide, which we can put up now. So this is just a sample passage from Atlas Shrugged. And just think about what it actually takes to be able to read and understand something like this, even just at the basic level of the meaning. I mean, this is one of the great passages from Galt's speech, really fundamental. It says, "For centuries, the battle of morality was fought between those who claim that your life belongs to God and those who claim that it belongs to your neighbors, between those who preached that the good is self-sacrifice for the sake of ghosts in heaven and those who preached that the good is self-sacrifice for the sake of incompetence on earth. And no one came to say that your life belongs to you and that the good is to live it." Really important stuff, right? But this is not something that a child comes into the world knowing how to read. It's not something that a first grader or second grader can read and really understand the meaning of. Being able to read at the level that is necessary to understand, take in a book like Atlas Shrugged, is a skill that has to be acquired over many years. In a proper education system, a student would learn over the course of many years the knowledge and learn the skills that they would need to be able to do this. But do we have a proper, successful education system in America today? No, we don't. There are a few, I think this is well known to everybody here. I'll give a couple of indicators of how bad the situation is. So one is just a statistical one. The federal government tests students every year in terms of their ability on reading, math, a variety of other subjects. The most recent test of 12th graders found that 37% scored proficient on the test. It means the other 63% were below proficient in reading. These are the graduates of the American education system, and the majority of them, about 5 out of 8, are not proficient at reading and understanding things. Another indicator, this was a quote that really stood out to me in a New Yorker article that I read last year about it's called The End of the English Major. And this quote came from a professor at Harvard University. Quote, "The last time I taught the Scarlet Letter, I discovered that my students were really struggling to understand the sentences as sentences, like having trouble identifying the subject and the verb." End quote. I want to say again, that's a professor at Harvard University, Harvard. And that's a book, The Scarlet Letter, that used to be commonly read in 9th or 10th grade classes in the United States. So what we have is a crisis. It's a really serious crisis in terms of students not learning how to read or not learning how to read very well. And we should all care about that if we care about convincing people of a rational philosophy, convincing people of better ideas. If they can't read, how can they learn it? How can they be convinced of it? So, when we talk about reading reform, I think what comes to people's minds first, most of the time, is the issue of phonics. And that's rightly so. And I talked about phonics in my talk last year. I've written about it for New Ideal. It is a fundamental issue in terms of reforming reading education in American schools. I'll give a brief statement about that and then go on to my topic for today. So phonics is, for anyone who may not know it as well, is the type of instruction that teaches students how to get from the letters on the page to words they can recognize. It teaches how letters correspond to sounds and how to sound out written words. This is the fundamental type of reading instruction students need. It's indispensable. You can't get around it, even though the American schools have long tried to get around it. But what I wanted to talk about today in my talk this year, and this is sort of based on one line I had last year where I said, yeah, phonics is the fundamental thing. There are other things that come later. I'm not going to talk about them. Well, now I do want to talk about them. That's what I want to do today. I want to talk about two areas besides phonics, and mostly coming later than phonics, where the American schools are failing to prepare students to read. And part of the point here is that there are some positive trends in the pro-phonics movement. There's new steps being taken, a lot more people being convinced, more schools changing their approach in favor of more and more consistent phonics. But we need more if we want students to be able to read the Scarlet Letter or Atlas Shrugged. So the two issues I want to talk about today. One is that the schools do not build knowledge. They do not build knowledge about the world. Two is that the schools do not teach writing very much or very well. So first, knowledge. Why is this an important issue? I'll briefly indicate why this matters. Think about what it would be like if you tried to read a dense theoretical paper in a subject that you're not an expert in. If, for those of you who are not physicists, imagine reading a paper in the theoretical physics, a new publication about a new discovery. How well would you be able to understand that? Probably not very well. And it wouldn't be about you don't know how to decode the letters into words, you don't know how to sound out the words. That wouldn't be it. And it probably wouldn't even be you don't understand the grammar of the sentences. It would be, this is talking about a bunch of stuff that I've never heard of, or I've heard of, but I don't know what it is. This thing is telling me about this new attribute of the lepton that's discovered, but I have no idea what a lepton is. And I have no idea how it connects to anything that I know at all. On the other hand, those who are physicists, or if you can imagine reading a paper in a subject that you do have expertise in, you're able to read it, you're able to understand it, you're able to follow along. So the basic point here is that your ability to read and understand something is heavily dependent on the knowledge that you have, whether you have the relevant context of knowledge that makes the thing that you're reading comprehensible to you. There's a famous study that illustrates how this works in the context of schools and children. And part of why it just matters is that children know a lot less than adults. So they have a much narrower range of things that they can read and understand. The little experiment is you have a class of children. Some watch baseball all the time. They're baseball fans. They know all about the game. Some don't watch baseball. They don't know about it. They don't care about it. You have all the children read a description of some events that happen in a baseball game, and you test how well they understood what they read. The result is exactly what you expect. The children who know about baseball, follow the game, are able to understand it very well. The ones that don't know a lot about baseball, they're struck with all of this jargon, these terms, inning, ground ball, that they don't have any idea what it means, and they struggle to understand the meaning of the passage. So the point is, the more that you know, the more that you can read. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But this is totally not how the American schools operate around this. It's not how they think about this issue, and it's not reflected in their practice. The American schools act as though reading comprehension is a set of isolated skills that can be and have to be learned in a vacuum, regardless of content, kind of putting the content of what you're reading to the side, treating it as unimportant. The idea is that you can learn this set of generic skills and use them to read and understand anything that you may encounter. So what does this look like? Well, these skills have names like drawing inferences, sequencing events, figuring out topic. The figuring out topic skill, as it was practiced in one classroom, has a particularly vivid example of how really, I think, crazy this is. This was described by the education journalist Natalie Wexler, who has done a lot of work. He had brought this issue to my attention and has documented how this plays out in classrooms across the country. She describes visiting a classroom where the teacher was teaching some, I think, third-grade students the figuring out topic skill. And the way that the students were taught to figure out the topic of a book was to flip through the pages rapidly and just scan through them quickly to see what words or phrases came up most frequently. And if you see a word or phrase come up a lot of times, in this case it was a book with the phrase wild ponies came up a bunch, then okay, that's a topic. Wild ponies is the topic. And that's, by doing that and other sort of things like that, that's supposed to enable the students to comprehend anything that they read. Can you imagine trying to read Atlas Shrugged by that means? It's a book about trains or metal, right? It's crazy. But this is the practice in many American schools. Compounding this is the fact that American elementary schools have put content off to the side, relegated it, almost in some cases eliminated it. Some numbers. The average American elementary school, the average student in an American elementary school, spends about 19 minutes per day on science and 16 minutes per day on what's called social studies, which is a combination of history, geography, some other kind of humanities subjects. Total, so that's 35 minutes a day total on those very important subjects that have a lot of content and that a lot of what a student will read has to do with. I mean, if a student is going to read about history or a story set in an ancient civilization or a foreign country, or about animals, scientists, chemistry, they need to know about science, they need to know about history, they need to know about geography, but they aren't taught very much. And what is taught in the American schools is typically piecemeal, fragmentary. Teachers often aren't even given very much guidance from their administrators. They aren't given a textbook, or they don't use a textbook. They just cobble together lessons such as they can find in what time they have. And so you have lessons in science and social studies, but they're very disconnected, and they don't add up to a real study of a subject. And you can see the results, or you can see that these subjects are taught very poorly and taught very little, just in looking again at the federal test scores, this time having to do with science and history. The science scores are just about as bad as the reading scores. It's about 3 and 8 students are proficient, 5 and 8 not. History actually even shocked me, and it's hard to shock me with how bad things can get in American schools. The most recent test of history, this is a test of 8th graders, found that only 13% were proficient. That's just 1 in 8, roughly. 7 and 8 not proficient in history. It may surprise you how low that number is, although I think we see the results of that across our culture today and the ignorance that we see in even adults. So what's going on here? Why is this bad practice carried out and continues to be perpetuated? Well, if we were to ask the explanation, why do you teach this way? Why are you so focused on skills and excluding content? I think what you'd hear is something like this. We think it's best to learn these very generally applicable skills early on, and once the students have learned and solidified their ability to perform these skills, then they can go on later on in the later years and read it on their own or read it in high school, and then they can learn all that content stuff about history and science and whatever. They can do that later and do the basic skills first, these separated, detached skills. But this is a strange view, especially if you just think about how reading works and the kind of knowledge that you need in order to understand anything that you read. It's strange to think that these can be detached. So I think we need to go a step deeper into what's going on here. I think that this view, this focus on skills and at the diminishment of content, is really reflective of the progressive education view that is pervasive in the American education system. This view basically holds that it's best for students to discover things on their own, figure things out. There's something bad about having content presented by a teacher, having a structured curriculum where information is given, lessons are given, facts are given. It should be more about teaching students how to figure things out for themselves, come up with their own knowledge. There's a subjective aspect of this too, where we don't want to say these are the facts. You need to know these. No, the students should be able to kind of figure out their own facts. That's the kind of attitude that comes out of progressive education and is really influential in the American educational establishment, from the schools of education to the administrators to the teachers. This is the water that people are swimming in the American education field. Now, I want to say something about what's so wrong with this, and philosophically, what is the error or the falsehood at play here. So basically, this skills approach is an attempt to teach method on its own without content. It separates the method of thinking from the content of what one thinks about and knows. This is not how knowledge works, and it's not how knowledge can work. You cannot know or learn or read in this way. And this is a point that objectivism has things to say about. It's in the name, objectivism. It's the view that knowledge is objective. And what that means, what objectivity in knowledge means, is that knowledge consists of knowing something by some method, by a rational method, a method that is based in facts. That's how knowledge works. You cannot know something by no means, and you cannot perform the means of knowledge without actually knowing or learning any facts, any actual content. In education, what this looks like is on the side of knowledge without means, the practice of some poor schools, not as common today, of the students memorizing a bunch of statements, sentences, definitions that they have no understanding of. So they're being given knowledge, but they're not given the means of understanding it. The much more common practice in the US today is the method without content approach. It's teaching you some how to think things or some how to read things, skim through this and see what words are used most often. But don't bother with what it's actually about. Who cares? It's not about understanding about ponies if you're reading the book about ponies, or about ancient Greece if you're reading a book about ancient Greece. It's enough to figure out, okay, that's the topic. The topic is ancient Greece. This approach, the method without content orientation is an anti-conceptual feature of the American education system. It's anti-conceptual because it's contrary to the needs of a conceptual consciousness, of a student's conceptual mind. A student needs to build knowledge up, starting from perception, from things that they observe, to more and more abstract knowledge. They need to use the right methods and learn what those methods are, while also learning facts, while learning about reality. So what's needed is not method on its own or content on its own. What's needed is a conceptual approach to education. And a conceptual approach to education will integrate both content and method. This term, conceptual education, is one that I get from Ayn Rand. And she has a statement about this in her essay, The Comprachicos, which is her long critique of progressive education. It's a masterful essay. And I'll put the second slide up with the relevant passage from that essay. So Ayn Rand says, the training a student needs is theoretical, i.e. conceptual. He has to be taught to think, to understand, to integrate, to prove. He has to be taught the essentials of the knowledge discovered in the past, and he has to be equipped to acquire further knowledge by his own effort. So he needs knowledge, and he needs to know how to think, how to understand, how to integrate, how to acquire new knowledge. So the point here is that an appropriate conceptual education would integrate both content and method. The students would learn a lot about science, history, geography, and they would learn it in a way that they understand it, that they know how they know it. Not just a bunch of disconnected facts that are memorized and have no meaning, and not just these reading methods that don't actually teach students how to understand anything that they read. I'll give a brief example of what I mean. This is just to illustrate the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'll give an example of the subject of biology. Studying biology doesn't mean just learning isolated facts about here's this species of animals and here's this plant and here's something about it. It means learning how to conceptualize the type of living things that there are. It means learning how to classify different organisms according to their characteristics, the characteristics that they have in common. How to go from observing specific types of animals into, okay, these ones are mammals, and here's what the characteristics are of mammals. And these ones are classified as reptiles, and these ones are fish, and so on. A student who learns biology in this way will learn how to conceptualize, how to look at the characteristics and organize their knowledge. They'll progressively learn more and more fundamental facts about life, about living things, which is very useful knowledge to have. And they'll be able to read things that deal with biology, because when they encounter some new article or something about an animal or plant they've never heard of before, they'll be able to relate what is said in what they're reading to what they already know. They'll be able to read about something, see that it's described as a mammal, and know a bunch of things about it just by knowing that it's a mammal. They'll be able to relate what they read to their existing knowledge, and thus draw on their existing knowledge to understand what they read. So that's what is needed. That's the right approach. And that's what it would look like, in general, to move away from the school's failure and this disastrous approach of just teaching isolated methods without content. So that was the first issue where I think the schools are really harming children's ability to develop as readers. The second one, as I mentioned, is writing. The schools do not teach writing very much, and they don't teach it very well. Now, why is this important? It may seem like a fairly basic point, but it's worth really emphasizing, and the more that I learn about this field, the more it stands out to me is this is a really important fact. And that is, learning reading and learning writing are related. They're closely related. Getting better at reading helps you become better at writing. Getting better at writing helps you get better at reading and comprehending. There's a reciprocal relationship between these two. Now, this makes a lot of sense because you're dealing with the same sort of thing, right? You're putting words on paper, or you're reading words off of paper. It makes a lot of sense. And by the way, there's things to say about this as it pertains to phonics as well that if I was doing my talk from last year again, I probably would say more about, and you can ask me in the question period if you want to hear more about that. But in regard to this topic, what I particularly want to talk about here is writing at the level of sentences. And then this builds up to paragraphs and longer works, but I think the sentence is the fundamental one that really matters and isn't done very well. So here's what I mean. One of the big challenges of reading more advanced, more complex, more difficult texts is figuring out how to understand more complex sentence structures. Like, think about how writing differs from speech. Like, if you're reading a book, a philosophical book or a history book or a textbook, how does that differ from the ordinary language that you use in conversation? One of the ways in which it differs is that writing involves more complex sentence structures with multiple clauses, subordinate clauses related to the main clause and the other phrases here. It's a challenge for a learning reader to understand the relations of these parts of the sentence and actually make sense of the full thing. And it's because it's not something that they're used to in spoken language. If a book is written in a way that is very similar to spoken language, a child who knows phonics can read it and understand it pretty easily. But they will have a harder time reading and understanding something like the quotation on slide number 3, which I think will be familiar to many of you. This is one sentence, right? It's a really important sentence from a very, very important document. It reads, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." I couldn't even fit it, on one page. I had to go over. That's one sentence. It's a long sentence. There are a lot of moving parts in there, right? There's a lot of elements that have to be related, and you have to understand how they relate to one another in order to understand the meaning of the sentence. Like, what is this sentence really even about? Is it about how the course of human events goes on? Is it about the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature entitles people? I mean, it is about those things. It has things to say about those things. But what's the main point? What is the main clause for those who know the grammatical terms? It's not obvious, and it's hard to see how these parts fit together. Now, I think some students figure this out by reading a lot, thinking a lot about it, and they're intelligent and they're able to figure out how to piece together a sentence like this. But this is challenging for a lot of students, and it certainly helps to learn how to make sense of something like this, learn basically how parts of a sentence, how words in a sentence relate to one another. And this means learning the grammar of sentences, specifically the grammar of how sentences can be combined, clauses can be combined into more and more complex sentence structures. And a really great way to learn this, a really, really valuable way to learn this, is to learn how to write a sentence ultimately like this, but learn how to write complex, compound sentences. Because once you've learned how to correctly write a sentence with multiple clauses and relate them together in a way that is clear and comprehensible, once you can actually generate that, It's not so hard to recognize it and make sense of it when someone else has done it and when you come across it in a complete form. So this is a place where the reciprocal relationship of writing and reading is really powerful and can really help students read something that is more complex, more philosophical, involves sentences that you wouldn't typically see in ordinary speech. Okay, so that's the point about the value. But what's actually done in American schools today? What does writing education look like today? Well, not like what I just indicated. Writing is basically treated as an afterthought in comparison with reading. It receives far less time, far less attention. And one just indication of this that surprised me as I was looking again at those federal scores on all these different subjects. I was like, I wanted to find the writing scores. They test the reading scores every 3 years, and the most recent one was released in 2022 for reading. The most recent time that they even tested writing was 2011. That's a shocking apathy to this really, really important skill. There's not even enough interest to regularly test how well students can write and how well they're learning to write. And by the way, that 2011 score found that 25% of students were proficient in writing. So it's lower than the reading score. The teaching of writing in American schools, it's an afterthought. It receives less time and attention. It also is largely separated from reading. It's treated as this other thing that you figure out how to do in a different way, and it's in its own part of the classroom, its own time. There's no effort to connect the skills involved in writing and the skills involved in reading, even though you would think that those should be connected, that those would benefit if the students would benefit if those were connected. On top of that, the teaching of writing in many schools is done according to what's commonly called a writer's workshop approach. And this is basically what it sounds like. This is taking the approach of a writer's workshop for college students or for adults and having second graders who have not learned how to write a complex sentence, having them participate in a writer's workshop with one another and with the teacher. This involves a lot of encouraging students to just write a draft, and we'll talk about it and you can iterate and change things. Write a draft, write like an essay or a story when they're struggling at times to write a sentence. This approach also involves a deep suspicion of teaching the mechanics of how to write a sentence, teaching grammar, teaching how to use conjunctions and prepositions and relate ideas. This, again, you get the progressive idea here that there's something dogmatic, there's something, you're imposing your ideas on the students by saying this is the proper way to write clearly, this is not. And the emphasis is on encouraging the students to develop their creativity and to express their own thoughts and opinions. So you again get the subjective orientation of progressive education in writing instruction. And this is another anti-conceptual facet of the American education system, because the students are being asked to do something, they're being asked to do something really hard, writing is really challenging, without being given the appropriate guidance to develop that skill step by step. And they're not being given the body of knowledge, grammar, sentence structures, punctuation, to be able to do so effectively and successfully. This is, of course, totally the opposite of what a proper approach to writing looks like. Writing should be given pride of place in the curriculum. It's really important in terms of its effects on reading, also in terms of its ability to help one clarify one's own thinking about all sorts of other subjects. This is a point that Leonard Peikoff really emphasizes in his course on the philosophy of education. Writing is thinking, and writing something that is clear, that states something in a clear, comprehensible way, is a way of testing and clarifying one's own thinking about that thing. So I think that writing should be everywhere in the curriculum. Students should, and it should be connected to other aspects of the curriculum. Students should be learning a lot, they should be writing about what they're learning, and they should be reading things that help them take that knowledge further. And of course, reading and writing should be integrated so that students get the benefits of learning both at the same time and in an integrated way. All right, so what is the big conclusion here, the big takeaway here? Well, I think, as I've indicated, the American school system, the educational establishment in the United States, is dominated by a really wrong philosophical orientation that informs how they think about all sorts of issues, writing, content, reading comprehension skills, so-called. It's so ingrained that it's reflexive, I think, that not quite reflexive if you mean that literally, but it's so automatic for people to think in that way. And many of them don't even consider that there's something fundamentally wrong about this orientation. The orientation is towards subjectivism, so the idea that students should be able to construct their own knowledge, that's a phrase that's often used, write what they want to express their own creativity, their own ideas, use the type of sentences that are suitable to their own self-expression, not ones that are clear and comprehensible to other people. There's this kind of indifference to reality, to the truth. There's this orientation towards method on its own without content. And often the way that this is talked about is, well, if we didn't do it this way, if we didn't just teach these skills and encourage them to express themselves, then we'd be in the dogmatic, memorize everything and don't understand it all education. But that's a false alternative. That's just a false alternative. The right approach is to integrate content and method. The right approach is not subjectivism, anything goes, or intrinsicism, just take in these absolutes that you have no understanding of, but the objective approach to knowledge. Understanding reality by an appropriate rational means. So what is the solution and what's going on in this area? So in regard to phonics, as I discussed last year, and as you may have seen in headlines in the New York Times or popular podcasts, there is a movement in favor of more and more systematic phonics instruction. It's often called the science of reading movement. A lot of the leaders in this movement are people in cognitive science who have done studies on how people learn, how people read, what is necessary. And there's some good information that people in this movement have and some good points about what reading requires. These points that I talked about today, a lot of them were brought to my attention by some people in the science of reading movement. Particularly, I mentioned Natalie Wexler, but there are other people like the scientist Mark Seidenberg and the education expert Timothy Shanahan. And there are a lot of others who have good things to say about what reading requires. So there's some progress, some experts calling for a move in a better direction. But they need to be more ambitious. And we need to be ambitious about education and about what really will put students on a path to success. The education reformers, including most of the ones in the science of reading movement, tend to think about how can we modify the existing system to make it better, to add something that's needed? Can we switch out one part for another? Can we add in a unit on this? And look, doing that can make things better, can take us steps in the right direction. But if that's your whole approach, you're missing something, and you don't have a vision, a coherent vision of where you're going. So what's needed is not just to modify education, not just to reform it, but to really radically rethink it, to rethink education in a big picture way, to project an ideal and to think about what a proper method looks like from the right philosophical perspective, from the perspective that's based on the knowledge that we have of what a conceptual consciousness needs to develop. And to advocate a move in the direction of a conceptual approach to education, and we need to reject completely the wrong premises that pervade the American educational establishment today. And one of the big points why I'm saying we need to really rethink education top to bottom is that what I realized as I was learning more and more about the issues I've talked about today, content, learning science and history and all of these things, learning writing, and all of these things impact one's ability to read. They impact a person's literacy. What I really realized here is that a highly literate person is a well-educated person. Reading isn't something that you can just put over in one side and teach someone to be highly literate while leaving them ignorant of reality, leaving them unable to write. You can't just separate it out that way. I mean, you could get them to read read a little bit. But to really develop students who are able to read things like Atlas Shrugged and to think about important, life-changing, culture-changing ideas, we need highly literate people, and that requires an education that is integrated, conceptual, involves learning, writing, content, all sorts of important knowledge, and how to think about that knowledge. Now, this is an ambitious goal for education reform, for education rethinking. And it's not something that we will achieve overnight, and at first it will be steps in a better direction. But I think it's important to identify this ambitious goal and to say what's going on is not a little bit wrong or a little bit bad. It's fundamentally wrong. And we need to rethink education top to bottom and promote a conceptual approach that will actually help students develop their minds and become highly literate, highly educated people. It's ambitious, but it's a goal worth fighting for. Thank you.
I was certainly looking forward to this talk after your talk last year about phonics, and I think it certainly lived up to the hype. Though I want to ask, in what ways can we implement this widespread reform change? Is it through private options? Is it from arguing to the boards of education or in our local areas? Or is it taking it all the way to the top to the Department of Education? How do we enact this call to action?
So Ayn Rand has a statement at the end of her essay, The Comprachicos, that we need to fight the educational establishment from top to bottom, from inside and outside, from nursery schools to colleges. And I think that's right. We need to fight on, there are a lot of different fronts in which to fight this. And I think it's good to try to impact public schools and move them in a better direction. It's good to create private alternatives and try to get people to leave the public school system to the extent that they're able. It's good to challenge your local school board or even your children's teacher, and it's good to challenge the top esteemed people in the government departments of education. But what's important is to have a vision of what you're trying to do, and a direction that is not just here's one thing, but what we're trying to create an education system that, or not a system, because we don't even think there should be like one system. So that's also part of it. Advocate for education freedom. That's a really big issue. But to have a vision of we need education that actually teaches students to know and to think and to be really highly educated, literate, thoughtful people.
Thank you kindly.
You said that writing should be primary in the curriculum and there should be writing throughout the curriculum. What do you say to teachers who will say that we can't have more writing, writing is too hard to teach and it's too hard to grade?
Well, if it's too hard to teach, you're not going to teach it, and then students won't be able to write? No, I understand that objection, and it's a challenge that teachers who are within, especially within the public school system, but who are within, working in schools where there's policy being set from the top, it's a challenge that they face. They have limited time, limited resources. They're often not, given a lot of help from their administrators. So it's a real challenge, and there's sometimes limits to what you can do in a particular job and in a particular context. But writing is so fundamental, and it helps in so many other areas that I think the more that you can prioritize it, even if you can't get it to the full point of what an ideal classroom would do, I think it's moving in that direction is better than not moving in that direction. So part of my point is I'm saying we need to have an ambitious goal, but that doesn't mean saying, okay, if we don't get the full perfect system, then who cares about making anything better? Take what steps you can in the favor of a better direction, in favor of better meeting the students' intellectual needs.
Hi. So there's been a movement recently, mostly being spearheaded by Jonathan Haidt, around social media and smartphone usage. For a long time, I've been highly sympathetic to the view that smartphone usage is fragmenting kids' attention and that is fundamentally anti-conceptual. But I wasn't aware of sort of these bad educational practices you were describing. Do you view smartphone usage by kids as a completely peripheral issue, or do you think it's fundamentally tied in some way to these issues?
I don't have a definite view on this. So I'm familiar with, I haven't read Haidt's most recent book on this yet, but I've heard some of what he has to say about it. And there are real questions about what kind of smartphone use should children be encouraged to participate in, or should their parents give them a smartphone at a certain age? I think there's real questions there, and I think I at least would need to know more to have a definite opinion about that. But that's not primarily, I think, an issue for educators or for schools, except insofar as they're setting policies about whether you can use the phone during the school day. So I think from the education perspective, make the education more integrated, more conceptual. And then I think we just need to learn more about and think more about the smartphone use from the perspective of parenting.
How do you explain the fact that education is so bad, but at the same time we live in a culture that seems to be smarter, more productive, more conceptual than ever? Well, except for politics.
Yeah, I'm not sure more conceptual than ever.
Yeah.
So there's, I think probably what you're referring to is the sciences and technology and things like that have been, seen amazing achievements. We continue to see amazing things that people are able to do in those fields. At least part of what's going on there is, or two things that come to mind for that. One is that there are certain children who are really intelligent, really motivated, really ambitious, who are able to overcome a lot of bad education. They just want to learn, and even if the school is giving them nothing to sort of fuel that, they find a way to learn. And some of them have parents who say, okay, we'll do this outside of school and help you learn what you're interested in.
My top student learned everything outside of school. Everything.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately too often what those highly intelligent, motivated students have to do.
Yeah.
The other thing is that there is a divide between the sciences and the humanities in terms of how well they're understood and how well they're taught even. So with what I was talking about today about the content subjects, they're not taught very much in elementary schools. There's attempts to teach them in secondary education. And it's probably better in the sciences, not good, not ideal, but better than the humanities. And colleges, like if you go to college and get a degree in the sciences, you can get some valuable things as opposed to the humanities where you don't really get a value. So that's my guess, but to fully explain how that works causally, that'd be a big question.
Thanks.
We've seen that many of our top thinkers in the US are either immigrants from countries with much better education systems or come from communities that have their own after-school and weekend education programs. Everything you said so far has been restricted to the current American environment. Aren't there places and cultures that we should be learning from?
Very likely. Yeah, I've mainly talked about the American situation because it's what I've studied, and it's a big thing to study the education system of even one country, let alone multiple. But yes, we should. I mean, it's good to look at what practices are occurring elsewhere, and are there better ones that we can learn from. And I think you mentioned after-school programs or things like that. That's also a way of fighting the educational establishment or going around it and saying, okay, we're going to offer this program that gives students the education that they're not getting during the school day. And that helps as well. So it's certainly worth thinking about those things.
Thanks for this talk, Sam. I was tutoring in an organization just like what you described, and one thing that I found I had to do was cater my subject matter to my students. I just wonder if you can talk about the pros and cons of making the context relatable to their lives, specifically.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by catering?
For example, like I had one student who was disinterested in school but loved hockey. So all the paragraphs I made him write and read were about like his favorite hockey players, why they were great, things like that.
My initial thought on that is that I think it's a good thing to address the context of a particular child, and sometimes starting with something that they're interested in, you can connect to other things and get them interested in more. Start with hockey and connect it to how heat and cold works or something like that, or the physics of a hockey shot, something like that. I think that's good. And there is so part of the false alternative I was talking about is there's this idea that you're either subjective and you're letting each child just explore their own interests, whatever they are, however they want to, or you're just putting all the children down and telling them all the same thing and just dictating this very one-size-fits-all thing that's not sensitive to the context and the interests of a particular child. I think that's a false alternative. That you can teach good content that while also being aware of and addressing the context and interests of an individual child. It's harder to do, again, if you're in a public school where you have 30 students and you don't have a lot of time and you don't have a lot of resources. But ideally, yes, you can do both, I think.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for the talk. While we're waiting for your rethink to take hold, do you have any recommendations for parents in terms of what to look for in their kids' schools to evaluate them and what to supplement if they need to supplement?
That's a big topic, and I sympathize very much with the challenges that parents are facing today, because there's the public system, which is a bad option, and then the private schools you really have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. It's not a given that a private school will be better than a public school or will be particularly good. I think in general, as much as possible, it's good to observe the school and see what they're actually doing. There can be a lot of marketing language about what they do, and it can be sometimes hard to discern what's actually going on. So the more that you can sit in on a day, see what the actual practice is, and then try to form a perspective on what kind of things you think are important. So I've mentioned a few things today, like writing I think is really important, and teaching content knowledge in a sequenced and integrated way is really important. Do you see that sort of thing going on? Is it going on somewhat but inconsistently, and maybe that's a place to supplement? That's the type of thinking to do, but it's a challenging question, and I can't give the complete guidebook on how to choose a school.
Okay, thank you.
Great talk. I got a lot out of it, a lot of great recommendations. where do you see like AI fitting into the future of reading education?
What do you have in mind?
Well, it's just like like these AI tutors that are out, these like the Ayn Rand Institute's gonna be using in the future. It's like, just seems like a lot of new, exciting progress.
Yeah, I haven't thought much about how it would relate to education, but that example and that's a case where you're using an AI to deliver content that's really targeted at what the reader is looking for and what they need to understand. And so I could imagine using AI, for example, to generate texts that really target a student's context of knowledge and give them like the next thing that they need to know, something that's the right level of challenge for where they are as readers. That's just a thought, but that's a thought that I came up with right now. So it's not a considered view.
Thanks.
I was wondering if you could say more about the use of some of the government statistics that you cited in these conversations. On the one hand, you might say, if the government can't teach these things, why should we think they can measure or set any real standards for these? On the other hand, the statistics sound thoroughly unsurprising. So I'm just wondering if you've looked under the hood at all, or just how you think about these statistics in these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I do quote the government statistics with reservations and I want to know the context of what is being measured here. And I don't say that these should be taken as the be-all, end-all, these are the perfect measures for educational achievement. But I think they're one of the better indicators that we have, because it gives us access to studies of a sizable sample of public school students from across the country. And it's when the government reports federal government reports an education statistic that is bad, as they usually are, it's sort of an admission against interest. That the federal government itself is saying that the public schools are awful. So if they were putting out, oh, it's great, 95% of the students can read, I would be more suspicious. But these are they're not perfect measures, but you can look at what they're doing, and in the case of the reading statistics, it's the sort of read this kind of generic passage and answer questions about it. And there are standards for how well a student should be able to perform, that to count as proficient, to count as at a basic level. I'll say incidentally, the critics of these statistics, who are the defenders of the public schools against these statistics, will sometimes say that the proficient standard is too ambitious. Oh, no, there's no way you can get most students there. But if you really look at what it actually involves, like for the 12th grade ones that I had some of the requirements for being proficient, such as describe the key points in an argument, support an answer with full and specific evidence. I think a 12th grader should be able to do that. 12 years of formal education, 13 if you count kindergarten, should be able to do that. And I don't think that the proficient level is too ambitious. I think that the defenders of the public schools want us all to be content with failure.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering, how much of a problem do you think it is that children are not exposed to high-quality children's literature, and then they're expected to be able to just take a passage out of nowhere and be able to read these without having that natural scaffold? It's the idea that you can just read whatever you like, and then children are not actually reading, and if you look at how many children like to read, it's plummeted.
Yeah. I agree. It's both read whatever, go off and read on your own, and in the classroom when we're actually teaching you these reading comprehension skills and you're practicing your reading during the reading time of school and everything like that, it's often just a bunch of, page-length passages that have no connection to any other ones or anything else. So it's here we're going to read this random thing about penguins, we're going to read this random thing about life in Japan, and here's another random thing about children playing football. And it's usually, this stuff is not very good, not very interesting, not very informative. So that's another aspect of this that I think children are not given things that are worth reading and things that help them get really interested in literature or develop a deep understanding of a subject. And it's like I certainly would not want to spend all day reading these little reading test passages, and I don't think any children would either. All right, we're out of time. Thank you.